This is Steffen Schmidt for InsiderIowa.com. Um, Doing a little radio broadcast on the situation in Egypt, and it's been a busy day, of course. Two events followed one another in blinding speed. Last night, on Thursday night, there was an announcement by President Mubarak that he was not going to resign, and that he would stay on because that was his responsibility. This morning we got news that, in fact, President Mubarak of Egypt had resigned from office and been moved, or had moved from Cairo, I think, to Sharm el-Sheikh, which I assume is a temporary place for him to be. I think he has a large mansion of some sort there. I call this Egypt 1.0 or Phase 1 or whatever you want to call it, because as the tension was building up, the big question was what would happen in the short run with the large masses of people protesting against the Mubarak administration, and what its reaction would be to these demonstrations. Two scenarios: one, that President Mubarak would turn the military and his security forces on the crowd. He tried that with the militia and the secret police, and that gave him a moment of terrible publicity, and I guess they immediately pulled the security forces back again off the streets. The second scenario was that the Egyptian military would basically disband the demonstrations, would side with President Mubarak and his administration, and would, in the process, probably kill and hurt a lot of people as it cleaned up the streets and central city squares in various Egyptian cities. The third one was that President Mubarak would resign and basically turn the government over to someone else. The last scenario seemed like the only way to diffuse the passion on the streets in Egypt. And when President Mubarak on the 10th of February in the evening gave his speech indicating that he would not resign, there was really a great deal of gnashing of teeth, unhappiness, and concern that this would produce a tremendous surge of disappointment and anger on the part of the demonstrators and the opponents of the government. That actually happened. The crowds were absolutely appalled, and the level of intensity of their opposition to the government shot up significantly overnight after that announcement. The reversal of that decision by Mubarak within a few hours is an indication that he had a late night visit, and this is my opinion, we don't really know, but I surmise this from studying a lot of different events like this. He had a late night visit by the Central Command and by the major chiefs of staff of the Egyptian military, and they essentially said to him, we are not going to continue supporting you, and you need to now resign and move. And probably they told him that he needs to leave the country as well, which we're all guessing that he's going to leave the country and take up residency somewhere in the Gulf area, in Kuwait or Dubai or someplace like that. The reason I call it Phase 1 or 1.0 is that the Wicked Witch is gone or dead, but the interim president in Egypt was the former interior minister, and if you don't know what that is, the interior ministry in countries where they use that term is basically not like the Department of Interior, which deals with parks in the United States. It is the agency that deals with intelligence organizations and secret police, for domestic surveillance and law enforcement. So these are the guys that basically went out in the street and beat up and killed a lot of demonstrators when they were unleashed. And they are also the folks that were the enforcers of President Mubarak's 30 years, almost 30 years in office. So they are not well liked, and in fact, they are the despised secret police in every country where there is a dictatorship. So the vice president, who was formerly the interior minister, is not going to be good for a very long stint, because his legitimacy among the people on the streets is nil. It's zero. It is probably the same as President Mubarak's. And with him still now as president or interim president in control of the country, this is a very dangerous situation, because he could easily calm down everything and then suddenly unleash repression, and basically, either for himself or to return Mubarak to power, could undo all of this. I'm a cynic. I'm a realist. I grew up in Latin America, and I've studied dictators and military regimes, as well as American presidential elections. And so I am very, very cautious, and I don't have a lot of trust when situations like this happen. So the next question and the next phase will be whether or not the military in Egypt and the United States and the European countries, and perhaps some of the other countries that are allies and friends of Egypt, will keep up the pressure and will in fact offer assistance in stabilizing the situation, providing whatever assistance is necessary, getting the economy jump-started, and putting a couple of jumper cables on it so that people will see bread in the bakeries and the stores open again, and fuel flowing to the gas stations, and paychecks coming in, and banks open again very quickly. And then keeping an eye on the evolving political situation in Egypt, to make sure that a fairly significant coalition of political groups is put in place to make the transition. And that group has to be a group that includes respected politicians from most of the sort of opposition political parties and groups. Not too big a group, but enough of a group that it demonstrates an openness in the interim process, and then prepare for elections and carry out elections in due time. I think the next month is going to be the most dangerous time in the transition of Egypt, because it will be the period when we will see signs of the direction that all this is going. We will see whether the economic and political forces that owe their wealth and existence and power to Mubarak will basically resist and try to interject themselves into the process, which I believe they will. Nobody wants to lose their billion-dollar business and their connections and their influence and power and wealth overnight for a good cause like democracy. So those groups are going to fight back. We'll see how they fight back. We'll see if they are more powerful than the forces of reform. And we will also see something else that I think you should keep an eye on, and that is whether the opposition groups in Egypt will do what opposition groups often do in countries where they have just been liberated from a tyrant, and that is to basically form a circle and begin shooting at each other, or whether they will coalesce into a group that will try to forge a significant and realistic integrated opposition to Mubarak's forces, which are still the most powerful political group in Egypt. Don't forget that. And whether they can form a new political party, or whether they can form a system in which there is sufficient concentration of voting power and political power so that they don't fragment themselves into too many tiny little splinter groups that are then very easily picked off and overwhelmed and basically made irrelevant by the much more substantial continuing influence of Mubarak's political machine. You got to remember that many people in government, most people perhaps in government in Egypt, owe their job and their livelihood to Mubarak and the 30 years that he's had in power. If those individuals support a political party and political candidates that are still what I call Mubaristas, former supporters and still adherents to the Mubarak machine, then it'll be very difficult for other political groups to compete with them, because it's millions and millions and millions of people who have a personal vested interest. If, on the other hand, we don't make the mistake that we made in Iraq, or the Egyptians don't make the mistake that we made in Iraq, and disband and fire all of these people who had connections to Mubarak, but instead basically say, we are moving into a new era in this country. We need you. You know what you're doing. We need your services, and we want you to be part of this transformation. Then it's possible that they will essentially accede to both to a new political reality in the country, but also that they won't, by being yanked from their positions, cause the service infrastructure of Egypt to collapse the way it did in Iraq when we fired all the people who knew how to run the power plants and sewage plants and water facilities and so on, and suddenly left people with tremendously difficult conditions. So my greatest anxiety will be to watch all of this, and we will be reporting on it from time to time in InsiderIowa.com. This is Steffen Schmidt for InsiderIowa.com.